Hi, everyone, and welcome to Practice Growth HQ. Now, today we're going to talk about a really important topic. You are listening to this podcast because you want to grow your practice, and that means you cannot do it alone. You need your team working with you. And our topic for today is simple tools to get your team rowing in the same direction. I mean, let's face it, if we were to lean into the world of professional sport for a minute, every player needs to do what their job is to contribute to the greater good. And so it is in business. And so the perfect person to be discussing this topic is my guest today, Debra Chanty-Taylor. Now, she's a seasoned business owner, certified EOS implementer, a leadership coach with extensive experience. She successfully worked with over 600 businesses, helping them excel and achieve their vision. She's all the way from Auckland, New Zealand. She may just be our first guest on the podcast from over the ditch. Welcome, Debra.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to be here. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, me too. All right, Debra, we like to start with the fast five, kind of quicker questions, quicker answers to help the visitors, the guests get to know you. The guests, the listeners, I'll get there, listeners. Question one, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the UK. I actually grew up in a county that got disestablished for a while. So for a long while, I grew up in a place that didn't exist, but it's called Rutland.
There you go. Yes, I was going to say, you don't sound like you've got a New Zealand accent. Question two, Debra, favorite book besides your own?
I am a real fan of Patrick Lencioni, and so any of Patrick Lencioni's work, but definitely The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, one of my favorites.
Yes, he's a cracker, isn't he? I reckon I've read about, yes. I think I've read about 8 Patrick Lencioni books, and he's fantastic. It's I'm sorry to digress for a moment. It's written as a business fable. So it's like a story, but it's got the principles running through it. It's so easy to read. Question three, what's one of your superpowers?
One of my superpowers, I think, is just simplifying stuff down, is really taking the complex and translating it into plain old English.
Good job. Question four, something you wish your 20-year-old self knew.
That it's okay to ask for help. And in fact, if you don't ask for help, not only are you losing out, but you're actually ripping off other people as well, because you're not allowing them to feel great for helping you.
Yeah, interesting. I love that perspective. And finally, question five, Debra, something you're grateful for.
Oh, I'm grateful for what I do day in, day out. I happen to love what I do. I happen to love where I live. I'm pretty much grateful for my entire life, to be honest.
Well, what a great perspective, and something that we can all take a little dose of. And as this interview goes on, listeners, I know Debra, and she is full of energy. She's full of life. And if nothing else, you're going to finish this interview feeling like you've got an extra pep in your step. Now, Debra, today we're talking about getting our team rowing in the same directions and some simple tools that we can do. Let's start with the problem. Why don't our team all row in the same direction? Why is it that they all work together? I mean, they know what we're here for. Why do we have these problems?
Well, it's interesting because you say that they know what we're here for. And I suppose the vision does exist in everybody's head, but we're often not really good at being really clear about what that vision is and using simple language so that everybody understands where we're headed, who we're here for, how we're going to get there. And that's what gets on the same page.
Okay. So what are some of the barriers?
I think some of the barriers are that we tend to overcomplicate things. We also just don't actually necessarily communicate what's in our head. So as an owner of business myself, I'm often guilty of this, is that we think everybody knows what's going on inside our head, but we haven't put it down on paper. We haven't put it down where everybody can actually see it, and we haven't related it to what they do. So as a consequence, it's like crystal clear to me, but nobody else seems to know what we're actually doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a podcast that I listen to, and the podcaster says, it's one of my favorite quotes. It says, businesses do not fall into simplicity. Like unless you're deliberate about this, what happens is as the business grows, things get more complex. You've got to be really deliberate about keeping things more simple. Well, as I understand it, Debra, you've got basically a suite of tools that the listeners can, lean on to help us get the team rowing in the same direction. So can we start with tool number one?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as I said, the EOS that you mentioned at the beginning is called the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And it's based on the premise if we can focus on six key things, we will actually have a stronger, more sustainable, more scalable, and more importantly, more fun environment to work within as well. And the
Mm,
very first tool is exactly what you've mentioned as vision. You know, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So let's
yeah.
get really crystal clear about answering 8 very simple questions. First one is our core values. Who are we? How do we live and breathe? And how do we operate around here? Next one's our core focus. You know, why do we do what we do and what do we do better than anybody else? And then it's really getting clear on, you know, what is our 10-year targets, our really big, hairy, audacious goal? How do I bring that down to the ground in terms of our 3-year picture and a marketing strategy? And then into 1-year plan, 90-day rocks, and your issues list. If you can answer those 8 questions really succinctly and in language that everybody understands, then suddenly you've got a roadmap for where you're headed.
Wow, you've covered a lot there. My
I
goodness,
have.
it's quick to say, but that's not exactly quick to implement. Look, most of the
Yep.
listeners would be familiar with values,
Mm.
and we could spend a lot of time talking about those, but that's possibly a topic we've covered a little bit on the podcast. But focus, that's not
Yeah.
one that I've really come across before in this context. Tell us a bit more about that.
So I think in the old days we might have called it vision and mission, or we might have actually again
Uh,
overcomplicated it and had sentences and paragraphs and all kinds of things. We believe that it needs to be a lot simpler than that to really get people on the journey with you. So the core focus is literally 2 parts. Why do you exist? Simon Sinek's golden circle. You know, why do you do what you do? People buy why you do, not what you do. And then the second part is actually what you do. So Jim Collins' hedgehog concept.
yeah.
What can you do better than anybody else in the world? So why do you get out of bed in the morning is the first question. And that should be really broad. It could be as simple as making people's lives better. It doesn't
Mm,
tell people what you do, but it's why you actually do it. And
mm.
then the what comes down to what can we do better than anybody else in the world? The Jim Collins hedgehog concept is about the hedgehog knowing it can curl into a ball and put its spikes out and stop being attacked. That's what it does. That's what it does really well. We need to get laser sharp focus on what we can do really well and not get distracted by bright, shiny objects and other things that come along.
And was there a third one?
No, that's the core focus. Is those 2 parts to it? Is the
Two.
why and the what? But then having your 10-year targets. So that's really part of the big vision, right? I think that we're really good at overcomplicating things, but we tend to underestimate what we can achieve in 10 years
Mm.
and overestimate what we can do in the short term. So if you can just get again 3 to 7 words that really paint that picture of what that 10-year target looks like, without getting into sentences and bullet points and numbers, just actually our big, hairy, audacious goal is to get to 10 million people, or to help 2 million cleaners, or to help people, in a dental practice, is the number of people you want to help have the best teeth in the world. I don't know, but just getting
Mm.
really laser
Mm.
sharp focused on that.
Look, my goodness, we're we're about 5 minutes into this interview, and I'm like, we could spend the rest of the interview talking about what you've covered already. I do want to pause in a couple of points, and then
Mm-hmm.
we'll keep going through the 6 key things. Um, why do we do what we do? I suspect there's a lot of practices that just haven't thought about that. I mean, you've said it's, well, like if it's a dentist, we want to, look after the oral health in our community. If it's a doctor, make people more healthy. I mean, I suppose that's the theme there. Does it need to be any deeper than that?
No, and I think sometimes even a bit broader than that. Because I mean, at the end of the day, we all go into business to make money. So that is not the why we do it.
Mm,
It really is, what is the thing that kind of, when you're having those really bad days and you're
mm,
struggling to get out of bed, what gets you out of bed? And so my why is to literally improve entrepreneurs' lives. And it doesn't tell you what I do. I could be a personal trainer, I could be a life
mm,
coach. It doesn't matter, but it's actually why I do it. And it usually comes, I tend to ask the founder the original question is like, why did you first start this practice? Why did you
mm,
first go into it? What was it that drove you to do that? And there's usually a story that accompanies it, but it comes down to, that why you do what you do is why you started your business. And the money is just a beautiful byproduct of that, but it needs to be emotive, because at the end of the day, it's not easy being in business. And we all have days where we kind of go, why did I do this? Why did I leave my
mm,
lovely corporate job and come and do this? What am I? So
mm,
then why am I doing it? And for dentists, it might be as simple as you want to improve community health.
mm,
And then the
mm.
what you do is through the making sure they've got the best possible oral care.
Yeah, okay. Oh, look, in my business, our why is helping healthcare professionals win in business and life. And so we recognize that indeed for many of the listeners that they are great at being healthcare physicians, but that the business side is not necessarily their strength. And the helping them in business and life part, I mean, to be really honest, because unfortunately for a number of healthcare professionals, certainly in Australia, they've got above average rates of suicide. And so that doesn't sit well with me. And it's like, if we can do anything, and so sometimes we do charity auctions and we do a bit of personal development stuff. And that is the thing that I guess drives us. So that's good. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the 10-year mission, because I suspect I mean, Debra, this is your world, but if you were to have us, a string of business owners come in front of you one after another, my feeling is that you'd be lucky to find 1 in 100 that had 10-year goals. Is that true?
Yeah, it is unfortunately quite true. And I think it's because we tend to get very focused on the fighting fires and we get involved in the day-to-day stuff. We get really bogged down with that. And then we just don't find the time to think bigger. And I think it's, again, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So good planning comes from having a really clear understanding of where you're going. But we're often just so busy running the business, doing the business as usual, that we forget about what the bigger picture is.
So we're not wanting to insert the 10-year goals for the listeners. They're going to have to do that themselves. But what are the sorts of things that people might have on that list?
Yeah, I mean, it for some people, it may just be a monetary thing. I personally don't find that's particularly motivating, and it's certainly not motivating for your team either. So for a lot of people, it can come down to being recognized as the number one, or being one of the top X amount of in the top 3 dentists in Australia, or it could be helping a certain number of people. I had a cleaner I was working with where he said, "Oh, I want to grow the practice up to have 200 cleaners." And I was like, okay, that sort of feels like it's infinitely doable because you're already growing at a rate that would enable you to get there. What do you really want to do? And that's what the question you have to ask. What do you really, really, really want from this business? He said, you know what? I'd like to impact 1 million cleaners' lives. I said, why is that? He said, because I think cleaning is really undervalued as a profession. And I want people to understand that cleaning is a great profession and you can make a good business out of it. So I want to impact 1 million cleaners' lives. I said, why don't you set that as your 10-year target? And his immediate response was, but I don't know how. And it's like, that's okay. Because in actual fact, this is about that compass, that direction, that getting people rowing in the right direction. You may not get to that ultimate goal, but if you keep aiming for it, aim for the moon, and if you don't get there, you'll at least get to the top of the trees. It's like, at least you're heading in the right direction. So and that was what he really, really wanted to do, but he was too scared to articulate it because he didn't know how.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say every single listener at this point could sort of sit down and go, well, yeah, what is the impact that we want? I've certainly dealt with a number of healthcare professionals who they would say, I want to have a certain level of business success so I can do basically free healthcare on the side, or whether they go on mission trips, or indeed it could be, literally just have more time to spend with their family. For others, it can be things like, they develop a bit of a side hustle. We spoke about this on the podcast a few weeks ago, where it's like, well, I'm in the trenches every day as a doctor, dentist, physio, etc. Well, I see the holes, and then I could develop a device or a training tool or whatever, and that could be part of the thing. All right. Well, that's vision, listeners, and I'm going to assume, Debra, that it's number one for a reason, because it underpins everything else.
Yes and no. It is interesting because it is certainly number one in terms of the 6 things, but we always still say that vision without traction is hallucination. So it's actually not where we start in the business, but it is important because you have to have that. So the other tools are really more about bringing that down to the ground, and how do you ensure that that vision just doesn't become an hallucination you never get to.
Okay. All right.
So
Let's talk about number 2.
people.
People.
People can make or break a business, and it's really important in a business that you have the right people in the right seats. So Jim Collins talks about the right people on the bus, but how do you ensure that the people that are there with you share those core values, want to work in the same way that you do, but more importantly, can they do the roles that the business actually needs? So I'm imagining a lot of your practice owners, when they first start their own business, they pretty much take anybody to come into the business. It could be just a family, a friend, it could be just a warm body because we need somebody to do it.
Yeah.
But what we learn is over time, if they don't really fundamentally share those core values, they're not going to be a fit. But more importantly, if they're not really capable of doing the job and they don't want to do that job and they don't get it, we call it get it, want it capacity, then they're not going to be able to help you get to where you need to get to.
So we've got listeners, they're going, I hear you, Debra. I've got one of those people in my organization. And I suppose there's a spectrum of people, aren't there? There would be certain people you'd go, that person absolutely gets it. They absolutely want it. At the other end, you'd have some people that are like, they neither get it nor want it. And then you'd have some people at the middle, which with a bit of coaching, presumably you could get them down that sort of get it, want it end. What should the listeners be doing there?
So I think ideally you want somebody who does get it, want it, and have capacity, because capacity is not time capacity. It's about the technical knowledge, the expertise, the experience, the qualifications to actually do the role well. You ideally do want somebody who has those three things, because they are, without a doubt, the easiest person to actually take on that role. They will just run with it. If there's a little bit of a doubt around whether or not they truly get it or they have the capacity to do it, you should only really take that person into that role if you are absolutely sure you can give them the time, the resources, the tools that they need to actually grow into that role. Because I think the biggest mistake we often make is we go, well, they don't really get it, or they haven't quite got the capacity, but they'll learn on the job. Well, we don't really learn by osmosis. We need to have the coaching. We need to have the education. We need to have the time. I mean, one of the biggest things we don't give people is time. Hey, I don't like doing this. You go ahead and do it, but I'm not going to show you how, and I'm not going to give you the teaching. So I would always say, ideally, you want them to GWC it. The one that I will never accept as a cross, if they don't want it, you've got to either find something else for them to do or allow them to move on. Because if you don't want a role, you'll never give it your all. The get it and the capacity, it's a case of, if you're not quite sure they've 100% got it, you've got to be able to give them that time and resources to get up to scratch.
Okay, very interesting. Yes, I think that's an important one. And that get it, want it, and have the capacity, GWC. Pardon me. Number 3.
Yeah. I always get a bit in trouble with this because I call it data, but apparently it is data. So, whatever you want to call it, let's call it numbers. Data is about having the business looking at things on a regular basis to ensure that we are on track with our business as usual and our rocks, which I'll come back to shortly, but really having the way of actually measuring that and measuring useful numbers. The amount of businesses that produce reports that they've just always produced reports on. What's the point of it? What decisions are we actually making on it? So we want data that can actually help us to understand where we're at, and we can go, there's an issue there, we need to solve it, or there's something not quite right, how do we get to the bottom of it? So just having that data is really important. Scorecards, we call them, so weekly scorecards that you're looking at every single week without fail to actually say, are we on track or are we off track, and trying to pick up on things before they become a real issue.
All right. I know you work with lots of different businesses, but let me put you on the spot. For healthcare professionals, what would be the sort of data you would expect to see on their scorecard?
Yep. So the first thing I would say is, what are the main functions in the business? Because once you've identified what those main functions are, every main function is going to have 1 to 3 measurables that you're going to want to take a look at every single week. And so for healthcare professionals, it might be the number of clients that you're seeing. You might be looking at things like cancellations to see if that's having an impact on what's going on in the business. You might be looking at average spend per client. I mean, I don't know if you can encourage that up or down in dental care, but having an understanding of what your clients are worth to you and how you can either increase that, or is it on track to do what you need to do. If you're thinking about customer service, have we got how many people are cancelling, but also are we having any customer complaints? I don't know. It really depends on what those main functions are. Would make you think. But from a sales and marketing point of view, this is one of the biggest ones, right? It's too late once you've got to the end of the week and you know how many clients you've seen and what you've actually charged them. What have we got in the pipeline? How much forward bookings? How far out is our calendar booked? How many leads do we have coming in from various sources? So looking at the leading indicators as well as the lagging ones to try and pick up again on those issues before they actually become real issues.
Yeah, that's great. And I can imagine, as the saying goes, what gets measured gets done. And so if you
Hmm.
are looking at that data on a weekly basis, then I suppose what it means is the capacity for things to seriously go off the rails is quite low. The capacity, getting back to the topic for this podcast, for one employee to start rowing in a different direction, to pardon the metaphor, you've got to bring them back on board. Okay, there's some
Yeah.
great stuff there. Look, I would think, certainly I mean, we've mentioned dentistry. They talk about chair time, which
Oh,
is,
yeah.
that the dentist, and it could be in any of them, physio, podiatry, whatever, that they're available to provide a service for X number of hours a week. But how many hours did they actually provide that service for? And then, as you said, what are your forward bookings, etc. All right,
And
Deborah, let's.
particularly if you've got multiple specialists in a practice as well. So, and knowing that there's always whenever you're providing services and you're providing people who provide services, you've got to have enough capacity to better bring new people in as well. So it's like there's a real fine balance between being fully booked and not being able to take up anybody else, or having people sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So when you've got multiple people in that practice, it's looking at the individual performance as well and saying, well, where do we have capacity and how can we actually improve that?
Okay, good one. All right, number
Mm.
4.
Issues. Issues is about, I think one of the biggest things that a lot of business owners tend to do is sweep things under the carpet and maybe not want to deal with them because it's a little bit challenging. It could be people issues, it could be, financial issues, it could just be systems and processes issues. And so trying to have a system that enables people to easily bring up those issues and start to really work to solve them at their root cause is a game changer.
And what sort of mechanisms can the listeners put in place to achieve that?
I think the first thing is actually having issues lists, like encouraging staff to come up with issues lists. So what is stopping you from, I always talk about 2 parts of the business. You've got business as usual. That's the stuff that just, keeps the money coming in, keeps us all employed, keeps the doors open. And then you've got the rocks, which focus on the more important stuff that will actually move the needle in the business and make it perform better. So I encourage them to go, hey, start recording any issues that are stopping you from achieving either of those. What's stopping us from hitting our business as usual targets? Why aren't we getting the important stuff done? And even just the physical thing of creating a list means you can't ignore it. It's there for you to start looking at. And then we encourage you to go, right, so the list, there's a natural tendency to go, we've got this great big long list of issues. We'll start at the top. Well, what happens if the issue in the middle is the most important issue? So before you ever start solving issues, think about the order of importance, which is the most important issue. Deal with that one first. And spend some time really digging deep into what the real root cause is. Because again, as humans, and particularly as business owners, we're all about providing solutions. And so somebody gives you an issue and you want to go jump and say, oh, I've got the answer to that. What other answers might there be? And actually, is that the real issue, or is there something deeper than that driving it?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. In 2 weeks from now, at the time of recording, we have a quarterly executive meeting in our team, and I've kind of come to the same realization, which is because we only do it once a quarter, the risk is that when we get into what's an all-day meeting, that we end up with a shopping list of 15 or 20 items. So I'm like, and I said to my team this week, I said, look, I don't want to do that this time. This time I want to focus on really the top maybe 3 or 4 issues, and let's really go into them properly, because those things underpin everything else. Yes, we could spend half an hour talking about, software and et cetera, et cetera. Not that those things are not important, but kind of keeping the main thing. So let's assume that the listeners have introduced their kind of weekly data meeting, which sounds like that could be one of the takeaways from this.
Yep.
Literally, what would they need to implement to get those issues to be raised? Is it like a whiteboard in the office where they have a file on their shared drive? What would you recommend?
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to the way the practice is run and what they like to do. I mean, there is software that can manage it for you. I love whiteboards. I think whiteboards are a really good way of keeping things very visual. And you'll see in a moment from the meeting pulse that we run, that also brings up issues too. So the actual structure of the meeting will bring up any issues that are stopping us from achieving things. But it's just literally having a place to keep them. So it could be, if you're a Microsoft Office user, you might choose a OneNote or even an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't really matter as long as everybody knows that we are about wanting to raise issues and deal with issues and solve them. So let's have those issues lists. And it's important to have 2 issues lists. So one needs to be short-term stuff that's stopping us from achieving business as usual and our rocks, and a long-term issues list, because they're not always issues. There could be opportunities, but things that we're not going to focus on this quarter because we have enough on our plate, but we need to not lose sight of it. So we have a long-term like parking lot issues list where you can keep those much longer term things. And then the short-term issues we look at every single week and go, right, how can we work through this?
Okay, that's excellent. All right, number 5.
Process or process, as my American friends say. Again, as humans, aren't we wonderful? We love to overcomplicate things. We love to really make these processes so difficult. Whereas if you think about it, if you're really clear on what the accountability of a person is and what the structure of the role is that they're doing, if you're really clear on the values that you live and breathe by, then really the process just comes down to the main kind of key things you need to do in a particular role. So thinking about every core process and going, what's the main key bullet points within that process, and allowing the human nature to come through by going, here's the process, here's the way we live our core values, here's the outcomes we want for our scorecard. How you do it, that becomes the human element.
Okay, that's interesting. I think process, particularly if you're doing something that's a bit different, then processes is, in a sense, that's the very essence of your business. I mean, in Australia, the number of practicing healthcare professionals is growing at a rate that's significantly faster than the population's growing. And so the need to stand out from the crowd is at an all-time high. Now, you could say, well, Angus, what processes do I need? It's like, the phone rings, someone books in an appointment, the patient turns up, we deliver the healthcare service, and off they go. And I'd say if you want to be an average practice, absolutely, knock yourself out. But for many practices, the sort of listeners, we know the listeners to Practice Growth HQ are not happy with that. Like, they're looking to stand out from the crowd. And that means you've got to document what it is that makes us special. I would think in the face of all this increasing competition, the one drum that I've been banging for some time is patient experience. It's very hard for you to competitively go, well, at this physio practice, we do, like hamstrings. I'm like, really? Yeah, you want $1,000. But if there's something about the way that you bring patients into the practice, the experience that they have when they are with you, and so they walk out the door feeling like they're the most important person in the world, now that can be a real competitive advantage. But that is your business. And if that's not well documented and well implemented, indeed, you can be in trouble. Any other thoughts on process before we go to number 6?
No, I think the other biggest challenge people have too is, you're absolutely right. That is the secret sauce, right? And that's what makes it really different. I mean, I'll never forget very, very early on in one of my businesses being taught that the way we answer the phone is we go, hello, welcome to so-and-so. You are speaking with Debra. And that everybody had to say, you are speaking with Angus, you are speaking. And it just meant that immediately the person knows who they're talking to. It's the last thing you say, they've got your name. That made a big difference to the customer experience. That needs to be documented. But the most important thing is, you need to have everybody following that process. There's no point in writing it, sticking it on a shelf and going, yeah, we've got a process, good for us. How do you train people? How do you lead and manage them to actually deliver on that? And again, it comes back to those scorecards and measurables. How do we make sure that is tied into the result that we actually want as well? So the process links through to what you're measuring to ensure you're delivering that unique experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. Truth is, I'm going and doing a 1-day intensive with a practice on Friday, a VIP day. And one of the things that we've done is a bunch of mystery shopper calls. They don't know that. And I dare say, and I'm not being critical of the team members involved. I think this is kind of human nature. If I go in and say, hey guys, are you aware that when someone calls up and asks about a certain treatment, that part of the process is you should offer to book an appointment for them? And they go, yeah, of course. Well, we've just done 3 mystery shopper calls, and not once was a person offered to be booked in the appointment. And it's that kind of, if I go on to the office manual, it would say you always offer an appointment, except that in practice it's not happening. So that's critical. All right,
So
number
that's
six.
tying it back to practicalities, right? It's like it's all very well having a process. If people don't know the process, if they're not trained, if they're not led and managed, it won't happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Number six, the final one. This is the traction one, right? So I said at the beginning, vision without traction is hallucination. And so the thing that actually ties this all together is this idea that we have got business as usual, which is 80% of our time measured by our scorecard. And then we've got these rocks, which are important chunks of work that are 20% of our time moving the business forward. And so in the traction component, everybody needs to have an understanding of what their rocks are. What's the one thing you're doing in this next quarter that will actually improve the business out of sight? It can be something really tiny, but it's like every quarter you've got something you're focused on. And then the meeting pulse. So having the quarterly sessions is absolutely essential. Quarterly and annual, not negotiable, but also weekly meetings should be not negotiable. Every single person should be in a weekly meeting where they're looking at their business as usual scorecard. They're looking at their rocks. They're looking at their issues. They're looking at the things that are going on and working through an agenda and a structure that encourages them to really deal with the big issues and get those things sorted. So that meeting pulse is really important.
Yeah. Look, Deborah, we in my company implemented this last year. We're not using the EOS formula per se, although it sounds very similar. We read a book by Donald Miller called How to Grow Your Small Business, I think, and he had a very similar sort of model. And so we have, there's an annual meeting. We've got quarterly meetings that I've already referred to. And then these weekly meetings, we've got whole team weekly meetings. We even go into sort of the sub teams. They may do something more often than that. And listeners, at this point, you might be going, like, Angus, how do you get any work done? But the reality is that these meetings don't, I mean, some of these other ones that are a more frequent one, they don't need to be very long at all. But it's just keeping the main thing. And, the premise of this episode was about getting your team all rowing in the same direction. If you're not checking in with people, they've got every opportunity to start rowing in a different direction, and you won't know.
And that's the thing, it's about keeping those circles connected and tying in every week, tying people's work back into the bigger vision. So where are we headed? Is this adding to it? If it's not, why are we doing it? And so just by having that weekly cadence, it's a little bit like, I always liken it to, if anybody's done any study, which of course all of your listeners will have done, when we had assignments due in at university, when did you generally do it? For me, it was always the very last day it was due in, up until midnight doing it. It's called procrastination. It's a pretty human trait. But if you know you've got a weekly meeting coming up, then you're actually shortening that procrastination, because you kind of go, oh my gosh, I'm going to my team weekly meeting tomorrow, and I told them I'd do this last week. I need to get it done. And so you'll find this like last flurry of activity right before the meeting, but that means we're getting stuff done every single week, and it's keeping them on track with where we're headed, so keeping them rowing in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. We do consulting with a number of our clients, and many of them have said to me, because that's usually a meeting once a month, many of them have said to me that they get their homework done, like the day before the meeting. I'm like, well, that's okay. That's 12 times a year when you are moving that thing forward, whereas it otherwise might have been on the sort of gunner list and never actually got its way off there over that period. Well, I'm just going to recap that for everyone. So we start with vision, and there's a lot there. Listeners, honestly, you probably need to rewind this episode and go and listen to that part again, because it's important to get that right. We spoke about 2 as people, 3 as data, 4 as issues, 5 as process, 6 as traction. I guess as we start to wrap up, Debra, some final thoughts on how we bring this all together.
Please, my desperate plea to everybody, just get started. Even if you just start with running weekly meetings and have some scorecard and some rocks, that is a great way to actually get people thinking about what needs to be done. And don't overcomplicate it. Try and bring everything back down to its simplest form. You said in the beginning, when you're first in business together in a practice, is usually you and one other person. Things are really simple. 2 people talking to each other, no issue at all. As you grow, you're going to make it more complicated unless you keep focusing on simplifying it back down. So keep getting back to that, the main thing. What is the thing I need to be doing? And just consistently meet, focus on that vision, that longer term plan.
Absolutely. Look, I realized we didn't actually mention the rocks. We alluded to them. It just means you have perhaps 3 big goals a quarter. It's just kind of what are the things that, if you look into the future 3 months time to go, what are the 3 things we'd like to implement? They tend to be more lumpy, hence the term rocks. and they can certainly make a big difference. Well, Debra,
There are also specific pieces of work. That's the thing I always say to people. A rock is like it's a distinct piece of, it's not business as usual that is always ongoing.
yeah,
It has a start, it has a finish. You know what the success is going to look like if you get it done. So that's the chunky piece of work you're doing.
yeah, and it can be things like, migrate from one piece of IT to another. It can be implement something new, this kind of thing. Yeah, I've been living in Rockland for some time. I actually quite enjoy them, to be honest, because you get to the end of the quarter and you go, oh yeah, we got that thing done. And it's almost like if you hadn't written them down, A, you mightn't have done them. But secondly, you might not recognize that you've actually made that progress and go, hey, 3 months ago we hadn't done this, but now I can see there we are, 3 rocks. Well done. Well, Debra, you have provided an absolute ton of value in our very short space of time together. If people want to know more or get in touch, what should they do?
If you just Google EOS for a start and Google my name, Debra Chanty-Taylor, it's pretty simple. There's only one of me out there. But there's a whole bunch of free information out there. We would much rather people did something rather than nothing. So you can go and download all the tools for free. You can find all the information. But if you want to talk to me specifically, yeah, just Google me and give us a yell. I'll be happy to have a chat.
Awesome. So it's Debra, Debra, and then Chanty-Taylor, CHANTRY-TAYLOR. All right. Well, once again, Debra, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. I love you to be on the show. Thank you.
All right, everyone. My word, have we covered a lot there. But as I say every week, knowledge is not power. It's applied knowledge that makes all the difference. So what's one thing you can do as a result of what you heard today? Make sure you go and do that before you go on to the next thing. Look, finally, if you got some value from our time together today, then I'd really appreciate if you head to where you heard this show, leave us a lovely review to give us the encouragement to bring you more great content every week on Practice Growth HQ.